So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk through the first Shiny app example that we have in the book. This one is set up with two files. There's a server.r file and there's a UI.r file. And those do the separate controls of the server, the backend, and the user interface. So when we start with the user interface, that's the UI.r file. So here the user interface is relatively straightforward. We're going to be providing a little bit of a header that describes the frequency of Beatles names over time. And then we're going to be having several widgets. One of these widgets, the numeric input, will be used to enter a starting year for what years of names we want to use. We have also a numeric input for the ending year. And then a widget called checkbox group input, which will allow us to kind of dynamically pick which names to be displaying. So each of these widgets has a slightly different structure and organization. Here for the start year, we can start the value at 1960 and have the minimum go from 1880 to 2014 in steps of 1. And then end in 1960, so kind of the main era that the Beatles were together. The checkbox input has a name here, an input ID of names. That's how we're going to refer to it on the server side. And then names to display is the kind of nicer human-friendly version of that name. And the names that are going to be available will be all of the ones that come out of this expression, assorted, unique of the Beatles names. And so we can start by selecting George and Paul. They could be our favorites for whatever reason. The last part of the user interface is what to display. So this is the plot output widget, which will be displaying the plot object. So now we can jump to the server.r file and see what things look on that end. So pretty straightforward. We're loading the tidyverse, we're loading baby names, we're loading the Shiny package. We're taking the Beatles out of the baby names and filtering those 4 names and looking just for the males. Then we have this Shiny server function, which is going to communicate with that user interface that we set up earlier. So the function takes an input and an output. The output that's being created here is that output $plot, and that's something called render plot. So render plot is a function in Shiny that will kind of go ahead and do its thing and return a dynamic plot. So here we're taking those Beatles, same Beatles, we're now filtering for the appropriate years that match the condition here of the input $start year, and that it's less than or equal to the input $end year. And then we're also going ahead now and restricting ourselves to only displaying the names that are in the input $names. So this is the way we do the back and forth between the user interface and the server. Last but not least, we go ahead and create the plot in ggplot and create those lines. So what does it look like when we run the app? So here I can go ahead and run that, and we can now see it'll open up this display. It can also be open in the browser, and we can see the starting year, the ending year. We can make that a little bit smaller so we can see it better. And so we now have George and Paul. If we add John and Ringo into that, we see we also get these other lines. We can change the years to be other kinds of things, so maybe 1950, and let's look through the year 2000. And so by this, we can see a bump around the Beatles, particularly for the name John, which had been in decline, came back up, and went back down. The goal now is to kind of think about extending this in some way. Could you do some other annotation or other thing to it? Perhaps could you add another widget that controls what theme gets displayed? We're using the default ggplot2 theme here. You could do another option to kind of make that some other. More later.